So, ever since I started posting to this channel, one of the questions I get asked the most is, will you ever do tutorials? I want to learn how you do what you do. To which I just about always say, I'll definitely post a tutorial sometime soon. But soon never came. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I am a lazy person, but I want to change all that and become not lazy. Also want to start making some money off YouTube. Anyway, let's get into this coloring and shading tutorial. There's a lot to learn about when it comes to coloring and shading, and I'm probably not going to be able to unveil all the mysteries of it in this one tutorial, but I'll do my best to go over some of what I believe are the most important things to keep in mind. Firstly, let's check out hue, saturation, and value. Hue refers to the color name, red, green, blue, etc. Saturation is how intense or vibrant the color is. And value is how light or dark a colour is. Another thing to be aware of are warm and cool colours. The general idea is the warm colours are red, orange, and yellow, and the cool colours are green, blue, and purple. Usually, warm colours appear bright, cheerful, and happy, while cool colours appear dark, gloomy, and mysterious. This isn't necessarily always the case though. It depends on how you use the colours. Combining both warm and cool colours can give a lot of contrast and visual interest to your art. So an artist who I think does a great job of this is RossDraws. I'll just give you some examples. So you see here, he usually uses the skin as the warm tones, the warm colours, and he uses the surrounding environment as the cool colours, you know, the clothing, the hair. Here, you've got it in the hair, the cool colours, the blues. You've got the warm colours in the background, you've got the warm of the skin. Very nice. Moving on, one of the biggest mistakes I see beginner artists make when colouring and shading is that they never vary the hue or the saturation. All they do is take the base colour and darken the value when they're doing the shadows. The same goes for when they're painting in light. They take the base colour and simply lighten the value. Now this doesn't look terrible or anything, but it does kind of look boring. Luckily it can look a lot better with just a couple of tweaks. So on the second example, I'm not just going to use a darker shade of red. I'm going to increase the saturation of the colour, and I'm also going to shift the hue over to a more slightly purplish colour. Now, let's move on to the light source. I'm going to decrease the saturation this time, and shift the hue like we did with the shadows. I'm going to use a more orangey hue. Add a cast shadow. Add in some blue ambient light from the background. Add in some reflected light. And boom! We have a nice looking sphere. Yay! Now this is a colouring and shading tutorial, so I don't want to get too deep into the topic of light right now. But I do feel like I just need to mention a couple of things briefly, just to help you out, because light does have a big impact on what colours you use. So for this, you're going to have Mr. Sun as your main light source. He's shining down strong, direct light onto this area of the sphere. And then also you've got your environmental light, which is all your secondary light sources. Like the light from the sky is actually a light source, which affects the colours of the environment. You may not necessarily be able to see it in the areas that are strongly lit up by the sun, but you can usually see them in the shadow areas like here. And you'd also get a bit of blue light in this cast shadow right here. So then next you've got your reflected light, and so the light's coming down from the sun, hitting the ground. Let's just pretend this is like sand, we're at the beach. And then it's reflecting the colour of the sand back up onto the red sphere. And that's pretty much reflected light in a nutshell. So another form of light that we'll just quickly look at is diffuse light. And diffuse light is light that's being passed through something like clouds or paper or fabric, causing the light to be scattered in various directions. The light source is spread out and weaker now, so this leads to softer shadows and less glare. So put simply, diffuse light is soft light. So I briefly talked a little bit about lights. So naturally, we're also going to have to quickly touch on the topic of shadows. I'm just going to talk about 3 types of shadows. You can have your form shadow, which is this shadow here. Form shadows are usually a little bit on the softer side, at least compared to the other types of shadows we're going to be looking at. And the form shadow occurs when light wraps around a 3-dimensional object but loses intensity until very little light reaches around to the other side. And so you end up with this shadow which wraps around the form of the object. A form shadow. The other shadow that exists is the cast shadow. It's essentially a harder edge shadow than the form shadow, and it happens when you have an object blocking the direct light source. So thirdly, I'll just quickly touch on something called ambient occlusion. And so ambient occlusion is basically the darkest parts of the shadow, which occur in areas where there's very little light getting in. Not even any reflected light is getting into this area here. You're going to get ambient occlusion because essentially all the light, even the ambient light, is being occluded. That's what occluded or occlusion means. It's blocking the light. So the most common places where ambient occlusion will occur are tight spaces, like cracks in areas where 2 surfaces are very close or making contact. Does this make any sense to you at all? Hopefully it does. So now that we've discussed light and shadow a bit, we can move on to one of the biggest things in shading, and that's hard and soft shading. And that's why I lectured you a little bit on light and shadow, because depending on your lighting situation, you're going to get a combination of different shadows, ranging from very soft shadows to very hard-edged shadows. And this is what brings us to another big mistake that beginner artists make, and that is that they don't vary how hard or soft their shading is at all. The thing that I usually see is that they'll just shade everything with the soft round brush, and so you get this extremely flat looking art. Don't get me wrong, the soft round brush is great, I use the heck out of it, but you don't want to rely on it for everything unless you really know what you're doing. So my invitation to you would be to try out this. Lay in your shading with a fairly hard edge brush first, and then soften up where needed with either a soft brush or the smudge tool. To any of my fellow Photoshop users out there who want to know what smudge tool settings I use a spatter type brush, I have shape dynamics on, scattering on, with scatter set to 25%, transfer and smoothing are on, and I have the strength at about 8%. If you want to blend the heck out of something, you can just increase the strength. So I'm going to wrap up this video taking you through some of the steps that went into this Billie Eilish portrait. The first thing you're going to want to do after you've got a lineup that you're happy with is to lay in your base colors. But how are we going to decide which colors to put down first? Well, I usually like to start off with what I would call mid values. These are colors that aren't super dark or super light. They usually lie somewhere in the middle. The same goes for how saturated the color is. I prefer to have a color that isn't super saturated or desaturated. Now, of course, depending on what you're painting, you may decide to start off with lighter or darker colors. It's really not a big deal. You can always modify the colors later on if you need to. The main thing to focus on here is color harmony. Do the colors match? Do they feel like they belong in the same environment? Or do they feel as though they don't belong together at all? Once we've got the base colors sorted out, we can move on to the shadows. So with the shadow colors, remember to shift the hue and saturation a bit. Otherwise you'll end up with dull colors, like our first sphere. Especially when working with skin, you want to avoid just using a darker shade of the base color for shadows because you'll end up with this muddy color. And so usually after laying in the shadows, on a new layer I'll start adding in the light, and this is where I really start to sculpt out the face, introducing new colors into the mix. Something that will really help you with getting your faces more three-dimensional is learning about the planes of the face. I won't get into any of this video, but I recommend you check out our website called Sketchfab. And type into the search bar, head planes. You'll get a whole bunch of 3D models you can look at to see the different planes of the face. It can come in handy. Another tip I'll give you is when you're first laying in your colors, try to stay zoomed out as much as possible. Don't zoom in super close, trying to put in a whole bunch of detail just yet. You can save that for later on at the end. So I'm going back and forth around the portrait, picking up colors with the color picker tool and doing a little bit of S and B, sculpting and blending. I sculpt out the face by adding in some hard edge brush strokes with the hard round brush, and then I'll blend it usually with the soft round brush. And that's kind of what I continue to do for all of eternity until I get sick of the picture and call it a day. Sculpting and blending, sculpting and blending, sculpting and blending. Once I get to the final stages of the painting, that's when I'll then zoom in and start using a much smaller brush to put in all of those finer details, such as highlights, texture, extra hair strands, yada yada yada. If it seems like I'm rushing through the stage a bit, it's because I am. I don't want to overload your little baby brains with too much information. So, if you want to see more from me, hit that red button thingy below the video. Do it.